So that's one position which can be talked about separately. But according to the Muslim reformists, or let's say even Muslim secular, I will talk about this phrase in a minute, it's not plausible, it's not justified to interpret the world, as I mentioned, secularly, in the sense that talking about the world and interpret it naturally speaking. However, it doesn't follow from this that you have to consider the relationship between politics and religion, or here Islam and religion, in a religious way either. It doesn't follow from this. You could pull apart religion and politics, politically speaking, in the sense that the institution of government, let's say, the institution of government, and what you're talking about as governance, let's say, it can be, or has to be, pull apart, has to be distinct from the state or the institution of religion. In a way, they try to talk about the trans-religious government rather than religious government, let's say. What I mean by trans-religious government is that you could take some ethical and universal ideas and attitudes from the scripture in order to just to be talked about and inserted in the society, generally speaking. But it doesn't follow from this that you have to talk about, or you have to take into account Sharia as the source of legitimacy for governance. It doesn't follow from this. So the distinction between political secularism and philosophical secularism is based upon, let's say, the source of normativity, source of legitimacy as far as politics is concerned. According to reformist Muslim, which you could regard them as a Muslim secular as well, though they are not happy with philosophical secularism, as I mentioned, because they are Muslim, they do believe in transcendence, they do believe in supernatural level, whatever their account is. Though they are happy with, the let's say, sacral interpretation of the world, but it doesn't follow from this that the politics has to be sacral either. According to them, the socio-political aspects of our everyday life is secular in the sense that just we have to take into account the products of reason alone here. So because of that, I am talking about the trans-religious account of governance and politics here. And they try to, the Muslim seculars, by introducing and accepting trans-religious government, which is happy with ethical and religious values, they try to talk about the democratic procedure as more or less is discussed and talked about in Western societies and cultures. So if this is clear what I'm talking about, you could regard reformist account of Islam and the ones who are proponent to this account as Muslim secular. On the one hand, they are secular as far as politics is concerned, as far as the relationship between Islam and governance, or Islam and democracy is concerned. They are secular in the sense that they embrace the products of Western culture in general, and democracy and secularism in particular in this context. So they are secular in this context, the reformists, unlike both traditionalists and fundamentalists. On the other hand, they are Muslim in the sense that they do believe in the supernatural level of the reality and try to interpret how things are going on in the world in a sacral, let's say, a religious way. By focusing on the distinction between localities and universalities, as I mentioned, they try to mostly focus on universalities. and read the jurisprudence and the Sharia or Islamic law in the light of this distinction, and try to interpret the localities in other way, and say that just we have to grasp the message of the ahkam or sharia here, rather than just the form. So what is more crucial is the message, is the core of these rules, rather than the literal way of applying it. So it seems that as a Muslim secular or as a reformist, you could subscribe to democratic procedure, as I mentioned, by introducing and focusing on this specific account of Islam, as I mentioned. And in such a way, you could see that in a way, Islam and democracy are reconcilable. Reconcilable in the sense that this specific version of Islam can be reconcilable with, the ordinary, let's say, account of democracy, in which, as you know, as the way in which it is discussed in contemporary political philosophy. In other words, if we want to talk about the relationship between Islam and democracy, we have to consider and take into account that which type and account of Islam is scrutinized or is talked about. What I'm saying is that if we consider both Islam and democracy as socially constructed concepts, as I introduced at the beginning, it seems that, to sum up my talk, it seems that some versions of Islam for sure are not reconcilable with democracy. They are not happy with democracy for sure, according to their account of Islam. Because either they do believe in the literal Islam, as I mentioned, or the esoteric and mystical aspect, but not talking about the Western ideas and so on and so forth. So when we are talking about the relationship between Islam and democracy, we have to be reminded that we are talking about which account of Islam and which account of democracy. The common ground, let's say, or the commonsensical account of democracy, which we well aware of, is not elaborated and discussed in this talk. I'm trying to focus on different versions of Islam, though democracy has got different versions as well, because it is a socially constructed concept, as I mentioned. So the big question of the relationship between Islam and democracy has to be divided in different questions, according to which account of Islam is reconcilable with democracy, which account of Islam is reconcilable with Western politics, or let's say the modern politics. Let me just add one thing and finish my talk. According to Muslim secular, it's not the case that democracy is justified and plausible because it is just taken from the West. It's not the case either. But it is taken and it is plausible and justified because it is ethical. That's the crucial thing. It's not crucial where does it come from. We are not talking about the originality of the ideas geographically speaking. So they are not influenced, let's say, they are not taking these ideas because just they come from Western cultures. No, it could have been otherwise. It could have been otherwise. For instance, if they were emerged in Latin American countries, they could have taken from that countries as well. So the crucial idea is that because justice, as I mentioned, or ethical values or ethical standards are trans-religious, and they are, the criterion according to which we could take some positions and reject others, because democracy and democratic procedure is just, ethically speaking, we are taking it and try to set up our ideas and our set of belief by introducing and incorporating these ideas. So that is, I mean, one thing which has to be taken into account as well, because one of the accusation or one of the ways in which these scholars and intellectuals are accused of is that just because they are taken from these Western countries, so because of that you are in a way terrified, you are heavily influenced by this culture and ideas. The point is that according to them, we could discuss it, according to them it's not just because they are taken and their origins is Western countries. No, because they are justified, because they are just intuitively speaking, and by utilizing our criterion, independent, let's say, criterion, or by utilizing and taking into account the products of reason alone, we regard them as justified and plausible, and because of that, we incorporate them and introduce them to the society and incorporate in our set of belief. So this is, I mean, the way in which they try to make a distinction between the literal aspect of religion and Sharia, let's say, on the one hand, and the message of it. And because they think that we have to take into account the message and the core, it seems that this core, according to Muslim seculars, according to reformist Muslim, it seems that the message of the text, be careful, the message of the text, the core of the text is compatible with what is going on in democracy and democratic procedure. So because of that, we have to take it. In other words, according to them, the literal reading of Islam is unjust and implausible, ethically speaking. And because of that, we have to reject it and put it aside. But, again, I mean, traditionalist reading, because this reading of Islam is silent with regard to the relationship between Islam and politics. So they have to make it clear what they mean by, or what would be the preferable account of governance in traditional Islam. So because of that, they put aside and criticizing these two versions of Islam and talk about the reformist account of Islam. And as I mentioned, you could even see you could trace it in Islamic heritage as well, according to some Muslim reformists, that, for instance, I mean, in the works of Mu'tazila, one of the great theological Islamic school, which emerged in second century according to Islamic calendar, which is mostly 8th century, something like this. They, according to these Muslim seculars or reformist Muslim, for instance, these theologians like Qazi Abdul Jabbar Hamedani and others, they try to give a rationalistic account of Islam, though they were marginalized because of the power. And another Islamic school, which is called Ash'arite, was dominant. That was, I mean, another issue. It has got lots of political and socio-economical reason why this theological school, Mu'tazila, this was marginalized, and the Ash'arite school was dominant. That was another issue. It's not relevant to what we're talking about today. But they try to focus on the point that it has got some, let's say, background in Islamic tradition, though it was marginalized, to try to take into account the products of reason alone and focusing on this reading of Islam. So they try to revive, let's say, this account of Islam in order to talk about theology, the very idea of revelation, the idea of prophethood, the very idea of God, and so on and so forth. Amongst them is the relationship between politics and Islam. And to do so, according to them, we could take some Western ideas as they are, just as I mentioned, not just because they are taken from West. That's very crucial. Not just because they are taken from West. No, because they are taken from West, as well as the point that they are just and ethically plausible. So because of that, which, I mean, is in accordance with the products of reason alone, so we take them and try to categorize what is going on in the political and social level, social and political realm in Islamic societies. Okay, so to sum up, it seems that unlike the traditionalist and fundamentalist reading of Islam, the reformist account of Islam is compatible with democracy, as I mentioned. And one point which has to be added is that democratic procedure is just, is ethical. And because of that, we as human beings who want to be incompatible with the message of the rules and Islamic Sharia, or with regard as Islamic Sharia and the Islamic ideas, we have to take it and categorize our ideas in such a way. Okay, thanks. And if there is any question or comment, it would be great if we could talk about it.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for your very interesting talk. I guess there should be some questions. We'll take them if there is any. Please.
Regarding Islamic democracy, for me it's not really understandable why you say...
A bit louder, please.
Why you say democracy in Islam, because for me democracy means that you don't enter any religion into the governmental constitute, and religion and democracy are two separated things to look at. And so why you insist, even in reformist approach, to bring some elements of religion into democracy? Well, what's the point of that? And how do you explain that? How can you bring some element of religion into the democracy and claim that's a democracy? Because the reason that many countries they are achieved to be democratic countries, because they separated religion and government. That's the point of their success. So I don't see any success with bringing elements of religion to the democracy. Can you please elaborate more about that? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I mean, I'm not saying that we have to take some elements of democracy and incorporate it with Islam. I'm not saying such a thing. As I mentioned, and just focus on it, I mean, we are talking about trans-religious government, as I mentioned. But trans-religious government, I mean, let's say, it's not the case that we are talking about taking some modern ideas from the tradition or the other way around, just they are trying to incorporate it mechanically speaking. Be careful of the distinction between the literal aspect of Islamic rules or Sharia, as I mentioned, and the message. What I'm saying is that by taking into account the message of rules, reformers try to reconcile it with democratic procedure as they have found it as a just way of governance. In a way, they are not, I mean, artificially try to incorporate and insert some modern ideas in the religion, as you say something like this. It's not the case. There were some Muslim intellectuals or revivalists, let's say, who tried to categorize and go ahead according to the project in such a way that incorporates some modern ideas to the traditions in a way that just to say that, look, there is a similarity between Islam and democracy in such a, from my point of view, superficial, more justified for both theoretically and pragmatically speaking, in the sense that it's not trying to reconcile Islam and democracy in a superficial level, just to see some kind of similarities in the first place. I mean, as I mentioned, in this account, to my knowledge, they try to say that for sure religion is established in a mystified world. Okay. On the other hand, modernity and modern ideas, they are established in the mystified world. So there is a gap here. There is a gap between mystified world, sacral world, the way when I mean lots of Abrahamic when Abrahamic religions were formed. Let's say 1400 centuries ago or 2000 years ago, and so on and so forth. As far as Islam and democracy is concerned, they are not saying that there are some kind of, you know, artificial, or let's say something which is very something which is superficial, in the sense that we cannot talk it about separately. However, they try to say that democracy has got different constituents on the one hand, and Islam has got different interpretations, as I mentioned. They, by the interpretations, by making a distinction between localities and universalities, as I mentioned, and by focusing on universalities, they think that this democratic procedure, this way of governance, is more compatible with the message of Sharia, rather than taking Sharia or Islam from democracy, or the other way around, taking democracy from, the Sharia, or taking Sharia from the democracy. It's not the case. That would be one solution which, to me, it seems to me implausible, and as I mentioned, unjustified. It's not the case that it would be promising and workable to take some modern ideas from the religion, as some scholars have done it and did it in the past, let's say, or the other way around, to see that there is a let's say, straightforward connection between religion and democracy. It's not the case. According to, the contemporary Muslim reformists, they are not trying to do so. They accept the point that there is a big difference between the ways in which, or when, democratic procedure built in comparison with what was going on in the Abrahamic religion. They try to, as I mentioned, by making a distinction between localities and universalities, and accidentals and fundamentals, they try to take some Western ideas, in the sense that the ideas which are compatible with the message of Islamic rules.
Oh, okay, that's a dangerous part. You think the things are compatible.
Yeah.
Compatible. Some matters in Islam, they are not compatible.
Yeah, as I mentioned, so this is, the ways in which they put them as localities, not as essentials.
But how do you going to solve that?
What do you mean?
Are not compatible.
What do you mean?
The issue regarding women or the gay marriage. They are not compatible with Islam.
Yeah, as I mentioned, we could talk about it one by one, but let me just generally say that you could, as I mentioned, interpret these ideas, these rules, in a different way, in the sense that even put some of them aside, because as far as socio-political rules are concerned, you could give a new interpretation of them, and to the extent that they are just, as I mentioned, that's what I'm focusing on. That. To the extent that they are just, you could take it. That's the whole point. We could go into details and elaborate one by one, step by step. But the general attitude is that, as I understood, is that you have to take them insofar as they are just. And by taking into account something as just and ethical, we have got a separate criterion. That's the products of reason alone. You see? So because of that, in other words, we are not talking about justice. We are not talking about justice in an eternal sense. We are not talking about justice which is not spatio-temporal, something which is abstract, let's say, you see? So this is if you don't take into account the localities, if just you want to take into account and accept the literal reading of Islam, that would be the case, that we don't care what's going on in the reality. That's what you're talking about. So this approach is going to be a kind of talking about justice in an abstract, and let's say, I think, in an abstract and not a practical way. The point is that justice, ethical attitudes, and ethical justification, and so on and so forth, they are entirely context dependent, in the sense that they are entirely relevant to what common sense think of them. Okay, so they try to take into account what's going on in the real world, and what is to what extent they are just, by discussing in this regard, and interpret the rules in this way, and take the message of them, as I mentioned.
Yeah, please.
Can you maybe say a little bit more about what, for example, if we take Iran, what difficulties the government is facing in terms of legitimacy. Because if their official position is that democracy is not reconcilable with Islam, and I think they have been chosen democratically, what difficulties are they facing? Because they are basically saying, you just shut up and we tell you what to do. So, you know, what are the people gonna think? Is everyone just gonna accept it? I don't think so. So how do they think that this way of governing is sustainable, and what challenges are they having?
I mean, this is a question which refers to applied politics. I mean, that would be another issue, you know. We could talk about this issue. What I'm trying to say now is that, at least theoretically speaking, you could talk about the relationship between Islam and democracy in such a way. As far as power and applied politics is concerned, the story is different, and theoretical issues and justification and plausibility is entirely different from what is going on in the realm of politics and the way in which politics is related to power. In other words, I am with you that there are lots of difficulties at the moment, but what I'm saying is that this version of Islam, if has got enough power, they can be dominant, and as a result of which you could see the way in which Islam and democracy can be reconcilable. You see what I mean? In other words, there is a distinction and there is a gap between a theoretical aspect of the issue and the practical aspect, let's say. So
Yeah, but
this,
what is the use of knowing a theory if you can't apply it?
that's what I'm saying. I mean, it has to have got some voice. That's what I'm talking about. I mean, the reformist account of Islam, and generally, and with regard to Islam and modernity, let's say generally, and Islam and politics or democracy in particular, it has been talked about since 20 years ago, something like this, and the majority of people, they are not acquainted enough with it, they are not familiar enough with it, and it, I think, to my knowledge and as I see, it is growing step by step. So when this account has got enough power, you know, power in a Foucaultian sense, in the sense that it has got a lot of voice, so this account can contribute to the reality as well. You see what I mean? That's the way in which just you can talk about it. It has lots, step by step, the audience, if they find it convincing, if they find this position, I think, promising and convincing, so you could see the results of it as well, or afterwards. In other words, I mean, I know what you mean and where you come from. I know what you mean. But it seems that we have to, in the first place, we have to talk about this issue in the theoretical aspect, from the theoretical aspect, and the political implications come afterwards. And the political implications, in reality, is strongly associated with the power of an idea. And you have to make the power anyway. You know, it's not it doesn't come from nowhere. You have to make the power of a voice intellectual, socially speaking. You know, because in other words, let me put it this way. If you talk about an idea theoretically and academically speaking, so the story is entirely different. For instance, just you want to say whether or not this account of Islam is justified theoretically speaking. You could write your own paper and somebody will reject you, and the arguments against and for are put forward, and so on and so forth. That would be another story, academically speaking, let's say. But if you are talking about reality, as you are talking about, which is very crucial, and we have to take it into account, it seems that in reality, it's not the case that just arguments are talking together. In reality, powers are conflicting. So if there is a power, let's say established power, or there is a power which has got its own voice, so if you want to tackle it, you have to build another power in reality. And I mean power, you know, in a broad sense. I'm not talking about force, as you know. Just in power, I'm talking about, I mean, as I mentioned, in the Foucaultian sense, in the sense that you have got your own voice and there are lots of audience for that ideas. for that idea. So this is another story which is entirely different from the academic aspect of the issue. And it seems that by discussing and negotiating in such a way, if the audience buy this position, step by step and gradually, this idea, this account is established. And then you have got your own power afterwards. And then you could tackle, I mean, the rival, let's say, and the, I mean, other ideas in this realm, you see? So in a way, I am happy with you, but what I'm saying is that generally, this is the way in which, if you think that this version of the relationship between Islam and politics in general, and Islam and democracy in particular, is convincing, so you have to go ahead according to your own plan and make it powerful as so far as you can. And that would be your own effort, but in the long term, the power could be built, and the applications of that will be alright.